that this afternoon. Yeah. Oh, man, you know what? I'm just about to go into a telecom.
The conference is in lecture mode.
Okay, while we're waiting for the webinar to start, please feel free to answer the question that we have open here, a polling question. My name is Wendy Burgess, and I'm a policy analyst with the Secretariat on Research Ethics. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us today. The topic of today's webinar is the scope of research ethics review. This webinar is designed for researchers, REB members, and ethics administrators, and is designed to answer the question, what research requires REB review and what research is exempt? It's a topic that was frequently requested during our regional workshops, and that's why it is the topic of this webinar. Okay, so let me start with some housekeeping. Please note that at the request of past webinar attendees, we're using both the internet and the phone for the audio for this presentation. So in other words, you can hear my voice through the computer and over your phone. If you're hearing my voice through both, it's probably a little disconcerting because there's a delay between the two. So my recommendation is, if this is happening to you, to either turn down the volume on your computer or hang up the phone. If you're on the phone, we are in what is called lecture mode, where your lines are muted. If you need to speak to someone, please call the number on the slide, which is the Secretariat number from our website. The material being covered is on PowerPoint slides that are presented to you using Adobe Connect. You should see one of the slides now. If you're having problems connecting, first contact your local help person and then test your compatibility with Adobe Connect using the test URL that was sent to you with your confirmation. If those two steps don't work, contact the Secretariat via email or phone. The address and number are on the slide and they're on our website. We're using a polling feature of Adobe Connect. This means that I can open windows with multiple choice questions that you can answer. An example is open right now. If you have your screen set to full screen, then you can't see any of the polls. So if you can't see the poll that I just referred to, it's one that says, I have completed the TCPS2 tutorial, then change your full screen setting using the button on the top right-hand corner. Please save your questions until the end of my presentation, at which time I'll open a window for you to type in your questions, which I'll answer verbally. Also, please note that today's presentation is in English only. The same webinar will be presented in French in exactly 1 week by Susan Zimmerman, the Executive Director of the Secretariat on Research Ethics. Both versions will be recorded and posted to our website in approximately 3 weeks' time. One last point. The demand for these webinars has far exceeded our expectations, which has resulted in some people having to follow along over the phone with a copy of the slides. To those people, my apologies for the inconvenience of having to do this, and I will try to remember to speak to the polls and the title of the slide when I transition. This presentation will be about 40 minutes long, followed by a question and answer session. So I'm on the slide that says technical housekeeping, and we have opened a poll that asks the question whether people have completed the online TCPS2 tutorial. And it looks like about almost 60% have not completed the tutorial, and about 41% of the people have completed the tutorial. And it's roughly, those numbers stay relatively consistent. Okay, I'm going to close this poll now, and I'm going to change slides. Thank you for participating. I'm now on a slide entitled Webinar Objectives. It's the third slide in the set. These are my objectives with today's webinar. First, we'll look at the general rule for determining when research requires REB review, and then we're going to look at some very specific exemptions. And then finally consider a common question, which is how to distinguish between research and quality assurance. Now, as I'm sure you know, there's no black and white in the world of ethics, and the TCPS is not a cookbook or a template. It's a set of guidelines designed to assist REBs and researchers who are often operating in the gray areas. In this webinar, I will use case studies to bring out considerations that might help the REB or the researcher in making a determination. The case studies are based on frequently asked questions that we get here at the Secretariat. Next slide, entitled Scope of TCPS 2. As I'm sure many of you know, TCPS 2 is a joint policy of the 3 federal research agencies, and institutions must adhere to this policy as a condition of their funding. This is laid out in a memorandum of understanding between the agency and the institution, along with other responsibilities. Next slide. Research requiring REB review. The default position of the agencies is laid out in Article 2.1, which is that any research involving humans or human biological materials requires REB review before the first participant is recruited. This is relatively straightforward, so let's look at some exemptions to this article. Next slide, exemptions from REB review. We're going to examine 3 types of research that are exempt from REB review. The first is research based on publicly available information. Second, research based on observing people in public places. And finally, research that reuses anonymous information that's been collected for another reason. Next slide. What is publicly available information? This is what the TCPS means by the term publicly available. It's taken from the application of Article 2.2. Note that publicly available information may include identifiable information. Information is identifiable if it may reasonably be expected to identify an individual alone or when combined with other available information. And that definition was taken from the application of Article 2.1. And keep in mind that the information we're talking about can take many forms. It could be print, electronic, audio, or video. Next slide, entitled Exemption, Publicly Available Information, slide number 8. 2.2 is the article addressing the exemption having to do with publicly available information. Notice that there are 2 categories, both of which are exempt. The first category is information that is legally accessible. It includes records or publications that are accessible for a certain purpose as specified by law. So examples would include things like registries of deaths, court judgments, public archives, or data from Statistics Canada. The exemption from REB review for this type of research is based on the fact that the information is legally available and it is protected by a data guardian. The second category speaks to information that is in the public domain and where there's no expectation of privacy. So for example, this would include things like press accounts, online performances, and blogs. In the application of this article, it further specifies that for this type of research to be exempt, it must also be non-intrusive, that is, involving no interaction between the researcher and the participants. The application also addresses using the internet as a source of research data and points out that just because people post something on the internet does not necessarily mean they have no expectation of privacy. For example, the members of a self-help group, which has a restricted membership, may have high privacy expectations. Often, internet sites will have their user privacy expectations outlined in terms of use or terms of service. Okay, so let's look at an example. Opened up a poll that addresses this situation. In this example, this is case study number 1. In this example, the researcher is interviewing a government official about public policy. Please read the case study and answer the question that you see in the window. The polling question is, does the first study require REB review? And I see people are polling. I'm not showing you the results yet, just because I don't want to skew the data. Yes, I see maybe 20, 30 people now have polled. See maybe 50 people. I'm going to broadcast the results now so that everybody can see the results. So for those of you on the phone, it's a polling question that asks, does the first study require REB review? And at this point, it's actually about 50-50. Half of the participants on the webinar think that the first study does require REB review, and the other half thinks that it does not. Still have some polls coming in, still about 50-50. Okay, at this point I'm going to close the poll. Thank you for participating. And I'm going to move on to the next slide, case study number 1, considerations. So in this situation, the information being collected is information about Canadian public policy on discrimination, which is in the public domain. And the interview is with public servants. The researcher is asking them questions about how to interpret the policy and how the policy is communicated to the various parts of Canada. These are both aspects of their jobs as public servants, and therefore the information being collected in this part of the study is in the public domain. Therefore, this is an example of research that is exempt from REB review. A contrasting example would be if the researcher was asking the public servants questions about their level of job satisfaction or their own personal beliefs about discrimination, in which case it would require REB review. And I think many of you probably also were considering, the later part of the study in which they'd be interviewing participants. Perhaps that's what you were considering when you were saying that this research requires REB review. Okay, let's look at a less straightforward example. I'm on the slide entitled Case Study Number 2. If you could read this, please, and answer the question. In this example, the researcher is going to monitor postings from his teenage Facebook friends and compare them with postings from his adult Facebook friends. Of course, there's not enough information here for you to make an informed decision, and I've not allowed you a maybe option on the polling so as to force you to make an uninformed decision. So for those of you that are on the phone, the poll question is, does this research require REB review? And I have not yet broadcast the results. About 30, 40 people now are responding. Again, we're seeing a mix. I'm going to now broadcast the results so that everybody can see. Looks like 63% of the people believe that this is research that requires REB review, and about almost 40% believe that it does not require REB review. The numbers seem to be growing on the yes side of the story. Okay, I'm going to close this poll now. Thank you for participating. And I'm moving on to the next slide, which is entitled Case Study Number 2, Considerations. The first thing to consider here is whether the information on Facebook is in the public domain. Facebook is on the internet, which is a public medium, but you do have to be a member to use it. So the medium is qualified somewhat and not necessarily in the public domain. The second question is, what is the user expectation of privacy? On Facebook, users can make some information public and some information so that it can only be seen by people that they've accepted as friends. When a Facebook user publishes content using the public setting, it means that they're allowing everyone, including people off of Facebook, to access and use that information and to associate it with them. So privacy expectations may differ wildly, depending on how users have set up their Facebook page. A third consideration is the nature of the study itself. Is there any direct interaction between the researcher and the participant? Or is the researcher only going to monitor what's already been posted? What type of information is being collected? For example, is the researcher observing whether participants reveal their birthdays, or is the researcher tracking things like participants' sexual preferences? Another thing to consider excuse me, is the site's terms of use. In its statement of rights and responsibilities, Facebook says that if you collect information from their users, you must obtain their consent. You must make it clear that it's you and not Facebook that are the ones collecting their information, and you must post a privacy policy explaining what information you are collecting and how you plan to use it. Excuse me. A final consideration is the perspective of the participant, especially having to do with Facebook. When considering users' expectations of privacy, the researcher needs to consider the possibility of having a naive set of participants who may not care about privacy at this stage of their lives, or whose privacy expectations might be unrealistic. So in summary, the considerations for this type of research include the nature of the study, that is, how is it being done and what kind of information is being collected, the internet site terms of use and user settings, participant expectations of privacy, and participant vulnerability. In this example, if this researcher is using information that his circle of Facebook friends have posted with an expectation of privacy, then his or her research does require REB review. Okay, next slide, entitled, What is Observational Research? This is the second example of research that may be exempt from REB review. And this is how the TCPS defines observational research. Now, there's more information having to do with consent and observational research that can be found in Chapter 10. But today, we're just limiting our discussion to whether the research requires REB review or not. Next slide. Exemption, observation in public places. This is the article that deals with the exemption associated with observational research, Article 2.3. It lays out 3 conditions, all of which must exist for an exemption from REB review. There must be no interaction or intervention by the researcher, and no expectation of privacy by the participants, and participants cannot be identified by the dissemination of results. And dissemination here can mean through publications, photographs, audio recordings, or video footage. Okay, so let's look at an example. Here we have, case study number 3. Here we have someone who's observing the behavior of people as they line up in a grocery store. The researcher is not interacting with the cuers, and they're not recording identifiable information, but they are recording queuing behavior. The question is this research that requires REB review? So I've opened a poll for those on the phone asking the question, does this research require REB review? And approximately, well, almost 60, 70 people. I'm now going to broadcast the results. So the vast majority of webinar attendees believe that this is research that does not require REB review. About 97% believe this does not require REB review. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you very much for participating. And I'm moving to the next slide, which is entitled Case Study Number 3 Considerations. Okay, so applying the conditions from Article 2.3, which I see you all did, we see that the researcher is not interacting with the participants. I think it's reasonable to not expect privacy in a grocery store, although the type of grocery store might change that. The third consideration calls out the importance of really understanding what the researcher is recording. how is he or she recording identifiable information? For example, is it a video, or is it writing summaries of behavior in a journal? And what is being recorded? Is it something like, 7-foot person with orange hair? Or is it just general behavior, like 5 people just jumped the queue? And then finally, what is the participant perspective? Is the researcher exposing them to some kind of harm by performing this research? So if all these conditions are true, there's no interaction, there's no expectation of privacy, there's no identifiable data, there's no exposure to harm, then this research would not require REB review, as most of you figured out. Okay. Next slide. Exemption, secondary use, anonymous information. This is the article addressing the third type of research that may be exempt from REB review, Article 2.4. Secondary use means the use and research of information that was originally collected for another purpose. For example, healthcare records which were collected for therapeutic purposes, but which are used later for research. The first thing to note is that this article is very narrow in scope. It's about research that relies exclusively on the secondary use of information and only if the information is anonymous, and where the research does not generate identifiable information, either from the way the information is collected or disseminated, or if it should be linked with other databases. This last point is getting at the idea that you may have 2 anonymous data sets that, when linked together, can provide identifiable information. Next slide, types of information. Anonymous in this article has a very specific definition, that is, never having had identifiers associated with it. This is as distinct from anonymized or coded information, which are also defined here. As you can see, the risks get higher as we move from anonymous to coded. An example of research involving the secondary use of anonymous information would be like reusing the data from a market research survey that was conducted in such a way that there was no link between the participants and the market research data. These definitions, by the way, are from the introduction section of Chapter 5 in TCPS 2. Next slide, case study number 4. We often get questions about situations such as the one in this case study, where a researcher is using information that has been anonymized or coded by a guardian, and where the researcher has no access to the code, no ability to identify the participant. It's an example that I would like you to consider now, please. The question usually goes something like, in effect, the information is anonymous to the researcher, therefore, does this exemption apply? So I've opened up a polling window for those of you that are on the phone. I'm not yet broadcasting the results. The polling question is, does this research require REB review? About 30 people, 40, 50 people now have responded. I'm now going to broadcast the results of the poll, and you can see that about 65% of the webinar polling respondents believe that this is research that requires REB review, and about 33% believe that it is research that does not require REB review. Let a few more people weigh in here. We're now at 68% and 32%, 69% for yes, 30% for no. Okay, I'm going to close this poll now. Thank you for participating. And I'm moving to the slide that's entitled Case Study Number 4, Considerations. The exemption that's described in Article 2.4 only applies when the information is anonymous, as in never having had identifiers associated with it. Therefore, this article does not apply, and the research does require REB review, as many of you know. Okay, next slide, entitled Research Techniques, but no research purpose. Sometimes activities use methods and techniques, like those used in research, but they're not considered to be research. Examples would include quality assurance, program evaluation, staff performance reviews, course evaluations. The point this article is trying to make is that it's not the activities that determine whether something requires REB review, it's the purpose of the activities that determines whether something requires REB review. If the purpose is quality improvement, it does not require REB review. If the purpose is research, it may require REB review. We frequently get questions about whether activities are considered to be quality improvement or research. So clearly this type of study is in the gray area. Often it's obvious that the activity is not research, but the activity has ethical issues associated with it. We notice that sometimes when a person is trying to decide whether something is research or not, their decision is swayed by whether it requires ethics review or not. The questioner often wants the activity to undergo REB review because that is the only group they know of that gives independent guidance on ethics issues. However, just because an activity shares research methodology and requires ethics review doesn't necessarily make it research. And it may be more appropriate for a professional association to review the study. Now, having said that, if the information that was originally collected for quality assurance purposes is so good that later the person doing the study decides they want to use it for research, then at that point it would require REB review because the purpose has changed to research. Next slide. Research versus quality improvement. This is the definition of research as defined in the TCPS in the application of Article 2.1. Note that the purpose is to contribute to a body of knowledge, whereas the application of Article 2.5 describes common characteristics of quality improvement projects as shown here. Notice that they are usually within the scope of an organization or site-specific or in the ordinary course of operations. Next slide, distinguishing research from quality improvement considerations. Here are some suggestions of other indicators that might help determine whether a study is research or quality improvement. My thanks to the Alberta Research Ethics Community Consensus Initiative for these considerations. They make the point on their site that it is the purpose of the project that determines whether a project is research or quality improvement. They provide questions that are designed to get at the primary purpose of the project. Questions such as, is the project intended to develop a better practice within your organization or setting, which would suggest quality improvement? Or is the primary purpose of the project to produce the kind of results that could be published in a research journal? They also provide questions that are designed to determine whether the study is specific to a particular organization or site, as might be the case in quality improvement, or more generalizable, as may be the case in research. For example, one of their questions is the project designed to support generalizations that go beyond the particular population the sample is being drawn from? Or, would this project still be done at your site even if the results might not be applicable anywhere else, which might suggest quality improvement? And then a final very good clue might be to consider who benefits from the study. Is it only the participants of the study, which suggests quality improvement, or is there a benefit to a broader audience, which would suggest research? Let's look at an example. I've moved to a slide entitled Case Study Number 5, and I've opened a poll that asks, is this research or quality improvement? Now, in this case study number 5, again, I'm giving you very sparse information and asking you to tell me whether this activity is research or quality improvement. In this case study, the office manager is questioning patients looking for ways to speed up the process of their discharge with the intention of modifying the discharge process and then measuring wait times to see if there's been improvement. And the question is this research or quality improvement? I have not opened up the poll publicly yet, but I can see that 50 people have responded so far, and there's quite an imbalance in the results. I'm going to broadcast the results now. About 85% of the people recognize this as quality improvement, and about 15% consider it to be research. We're up to 14% consider it research, 85% consider it quality improvement, 15, roughly the same, 15, 85, pretty much where these results are going. Okay, nothing significant has changed in terms of the results. 85% of the polling respondents believe that this is quality improvement, and 15% believe this is research. I'm now going to close the poll. Thank you for participating. Okay, case study number 5, considerations. What is the office manager trying to do? Her goal is to reduce wait times in her clinic. She's interviewing humans to determine how to best accomplish this goal. She has a hypothesis that reducing the discharge process might reduce overall wait times and wants to test it. Now, one question is, does the fact that she has a hypothesis make this research? And the answer is not necessarily. She's trying to improve the efficiency of her clinic and has a theory as to how to do that. But her goal is to reduce patient wait times. Therefore, her purpose is quality improvement. Now, does this study have ethics issues associated with it? Yes, privacy and confidentiality would be one example. And perhaps it should be reviewed, and probably should be reviewed by Professional Ethics Association, but it's not research, so it does not need to be reviewed by an REB. Now I'm moving to a next slide, which is a continuation of case study number 5. Now, in this continuation of case study number 5, we've the person doing the study, if the quality improvement process reveals interesting findings, the person doing the study is going to present them in a public forum in the hopes that others might benefit from her work. Now the question is, does making the study public change it from quality improvement to research? And I've opened up a poll that asks that question. I can see maybe 70 people. I'm now going to have responded. I'm now going to broadcast the results. Interesting. So we can see that about 67% of the people believe that making the findings public determines whether the study is quality improvement or research. And 33% or so believe that it does not. And we still have some votes coming in, although we seem to have stabilized. So 68% of the polling respondents say that yes, making the findings public determines whether the study is quality improvement or research, and 33% believe that that is not the case. I'm now closing the poll. Thank you. Okay, so in answer to the question, does presenting the findings in a public forum make a difference in determining whether the study is quality improvement or research? The answer is not necessarily. Her purpose, might be to share her findings from her own clinic as an isolated quality improvement exercise. Her intention may not necessarily be to feed into a paper or an article on the topic that generalizes the clinic's findings. Making a study public does not in itself make it research. A common misunderstanding is that you must get ethics approval from an REB to publish the results of a quality improvement or evaluation project. If she were to publish this study, she may be required to demonstrate that she underwent ethics scrutiny, but not from an REB. ethics approval may be required, but what we're saying is that this is not research, and therefore it's not the RAB that needs to give the ethics approval. So in summary, if the office manager is interviewing patients solely to improve wait times, this is not research, even if the results will be made public, and even if the study has ethics issues associated with it. And then, again, the office manager may decide later that this data could be the basis of a research paper on patient-clinic experience. Or she may want to assess whether this approach will work in other clinics. This makes the project research, and in this situation, it would require RAB review. Next slide, summary. So this brings me to the close of my presentation. The default position is, of course, that all research involving humans requires RAB review. Exemptions do exist in the areas of research involving public information, observation, or secondary use of anonymous information, but only within very narrow specifications. And then finally, just because something might look like research does not mean that it is research. Now, when in doubt on any of these issues, please consult your RAB. They're the ultimate authority. Next slide. Upcoming webinars. I wanted to thank you for your participation today and with your patience with us as we learn how to do these webinars efficiently, more efficiently. Here's a list of our upcoming webinars. I encourage you to participate in the evaluation survey, to which you'll be invited tomorrow by an evaluation team from Queen's. We're always looking for feedback and future webinar topics. Next slide, education resources. I would also like to remind you that we have other education resources, a fabulous interactive online tutorial that I can see that many of you have not yet taken, and that's designed to introduce researchers to the basics of TCPS2. It's interactive, it's interesting, I highly recommend it. And I'd also like to make you aware of a summary of our most common and generally applicable interpretation questions that we have on our website. In fact, both of these can be found on our website. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to open a question and answer window in which you can type your questions, and then I'll read the questions aloud and answer them on the phone. I'm just pausing here while people type their questions. Talk amongst yourselves. It takes a while actually to One question that is here is, if someone is doing research on himself or herself, does this need RAB review? Well, yes, this person is a participant in research, and you know, there are all kinds of issues that come into this type of research in terms of you know, the different aspects of ethics, but yes, ultimately I believe this would require RAB review. Yes, this is a good question. Article 2.4, do you have an example of anonymous human biological materials? Usually without at least quasi-identifiable information attached, such materials are not useful for research. Yes, you're making a very good point here. You know, the only example that I could really think of off the top of my head would be perhaps material from an archaeological dig or something like that, where there's, you know, absolutely, you know, there's no knowledge of the source of the human biological material. But the point that you're making here is that it's a very, very narrow stipulation in terms of this article, 2.4. There's a question, what type of consent process would you suggest for work that started as quality improvement and then turned into research? Well, often this would look like the secondary use of information. So it's information that was collected originally for quality improvement purposes and then now is going to be used as material for research. And this issue is addressed within the TCPS. When in doubt, it's always best to consult your REB for the best way of getting the consent process. The article in TCPS 2 addresses whether you need to get consent from the participants, the conditions that exist that you may not have to get consent, although there are many conditions that have to apply to that. And then if you do need to get consent, what are the various ways? It's addressed in TCPS in the Chapter 5, Article 5.5. But again, your best bet is your local REB. Thank you. Okay, here's a similar question. In the case of wait times, when the person does decide to generalize and present, and therefore needs REB approval, will this person need to get retroactive consent? And it's a similar answer to the question previous, which is this is a secondary use of information. It's Article 5.5, and you need to take it up with your REB. But on the surface of things, if you're using information that's identifiable, then yes, you would need to seek REB review, and you may have to get consent from the participants. I want to make something clear in terms of when we're answering these questions. The ultimate authority on what's happening in a specific research is the REB that's looking after the research. It's not the role of the Secretariat to second-guess REBs or, change decisions of REBs. The REB is the authority. They know the most about the situation. They have the most knowledge required to make the ethics assessment. And so all we're trying to do here in the Secretariat is provide, general guidance on interpretation, on how to interpret the TCPS. Sorry, I'll get off my little soapbox there. Whoops. Catching up here on some questions. There's a question, are you concerned that so many of us, including reps from REBs, are so divided on how to answer the case study questions? Researchers must be confused if they get different answers from different institutions on the same question. That's an excellent point. I'm not that concerned in terms of this webinar because I haven't given you hardly any information at all in these case studies. I just introduced these case studies as sort of something to hinge considerations on, to hang them on, so that you can apply, the application, or sorry, the articles to something real. So yeah, no, I'm not concerned that I'm getting different answers on these particular case studies because I didn't give you enough information. And even, if you were to look across Canada, the question might be the same, but each research situation is different. And so you might have the same question, but completely different types of research. And so you may not get the same REB response, to the same question because they're considering different types of research. And again, the REBs, the authority, they have the most information, about the local research. How long does it take to complete the core tutorial? Well, I believe it takes about maybe 4.5 hours. But you don't have to do it all at one sitting. You can save it and continue it on another day. And it's well worth it. I highly recommend it. I have a question here. Just to confirm then, even if a quality study has a hypothesis and the results can be extrapolated across all clinics, it isn't necessarily research until someone utilizes the data in another project. That's not exactly what I said, although I could see that might be how what I said was interpreted. What I was trying to get across in that case study was that the study applied to that clinic, and she, wants to make public what she learned. And she doesn't know if this applies to other clinics or not. She's just making public what she knows, and maybe somebody else will pick it up and decide to try it in their clinic. Or maybe somebody will pick it up and test to see if it's applicable across other clinics, at which point it becomes research. So thank you for clarifying that. Sorry to keep you waiting. I'm just trying to catch up here and understand some of these questions. So, some of them, they're not really questions, they're just partial comments. There's a question here about, can you give retroactive approval? And no, I mean, you need to get approval if you think it's research before you engage the first or recruit the first participant. So there's no such thing as retroactive approval. There's a lot of very specific questions here, like site-specific questions that I'm not necessarily going to address because I just don't have enough information about what's going on at your site. And as I said, it's not our role here to overrule an REB or second guess one. So here's a question. If I ask students to participate in an online survey of their experience at X university, the purpose is to improve student services, but I later want to publish the results in a journal. Does that require REB review? Well, if you're publishing the results in a journal as research, then that would require REB review. But if you're publishing it in a quality assurance journal, that may require ethics review, but not necessarily from an REB. It would require ethics review from an ethics body, or sorry, from a quality improvement body, a quality assurance body. I'm reading these questions. Sorry, and some of these I'm not understanding. So there's a question here about course-based projects and whether it requires REB review. There is, I think it's in Chapter 6, Article 6.12. It does require ethics review, but it can be delegated review, depending on what the REB has decided. So for course-based research activities that are intended only for pedagogical purposes, they could be delegated even to non-REB members if the institution has decided. And so that the institution may have deemed that it's appropriate that somebody at the department level or the faculty level approves this type of research. I have a lot of questions about this retrospective RAB approval. No, again, I think there's a lot of questions around, I'm starting off a project that's quality improvement, and then I want to turn it into a research project. And then they're asking, can I get retrospective RAB approval? It's not that it's retrospective. You didn't require RAB approval for the first part of the study because it was quality improvement. But the minute you decide to use it for research purposes, then it's considered to be the secondary use of information from your quality improvement project, and then you would require RAB approval at that point. So you're getting the RAB approval to use the information from your quality improvement project. You're not getting a retrospective approval. There's a question here about, really has more to do with consent than, it's having to do with the secondary use of information. If the participant has signed a consent form stating the X, Y, and Z purposes of the research being conducted, and there is identifiable information, should the participants be contacted if the purposes of the research has changed? And in this example, I believe the secondary information would be human biological materials. So, the TCPS, a very important aspect of it is that a lot of it is based on free, informed, and ongoing consent. And so there's a lot of articles in the TCPS that talk to when something's changed, or when something unexpected is discovered, or anything that might affect the participants' wish to continue to participate in this study, they must be informed for free, informed, and ongoing consent to happen. So I'm quoting here from Article 3.3, researchers have an ongoing duty to provide participants with all information relevant to their ongoing consent to participate in the research. And if you've changed the purpose of the research, I believe that would be an example of what this article is talking about. The question here, again, about the transition from a quality assurance project to research. It's not clear to me when a QA project moves to a research project requiring review. If local results are made public at a national meeting, there is the possibility that generalizations could be made. Does this not make it research? No, it doesn't. Just the fact that you can make generalizations doesn't necessarily make it research. I mean, if you're doing the study that backs up that a generalization is the appropriate thing to do, then that's research. But just making it public does not make it research per se. Here's a question about interviewing teachers in the school network about their interpretations of the success of programs in their workplace for the purposes of improving our programs. The question is this quality assurance or research? Well, I think the answer is right in the question. It's for the purpose of improving our programs. To me, that's clearly quality improvement, even though you're interviewing participants. Yeah, a lot of questions about this transition from quality to research. Here's another question about the one, when I'm doing research within a classroom, do I require RAB review? And of course the answer is yes, you do, but it's possible that the institution may have set it up so that you can have delegated RAB review. Here's a question. When students do practica at community organizations and undertake quality assurance for them, and then report the results back to the university as part of their course, are they exempt from ethics review because the intention was not research? Well, they're two different things. I believe these to be quality improvement projects that are part of a pedagogical exercise, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're exempt from ethics review. They don't need REB review, but they may require ethics review from a quality improvement ethics organization. Here's a question. If a research team is looking at human participants doing user testing to test a product, for example, to make a phone better, is that quality assurance? Making a phone better is really, you're doing the research to change the design of the phone. So, I mean, I don't have all the details here, but it would seem off the top of my head this would be research. But I know that this is a question that's come in recently for a request for interpretation, so we can, you stay tuned to our website and you'll see some of these more popular questions being answered in our interpretation service. What if a researcher is taking video in a public location? So individuals are identifiable, but the video is not intended for dissemination purposes. So this would require REB review because the criteria was that, you know, there not be, for that article, that is article on research involving observation in public places, that the information not be collecting identifiable information or disseminating identifiable information. And if it's a video, you know, you are collecting an identifiable information. You're collecting the image of the people that are there. Does a university course teaching activist research require ethics review? It doesn't. If it's just a course that's, you know, giving out information about activist research, I don't believe so. But I think there's probably a bigger story here. But no, not just on the surface of it. There's a lot of very specific questions here that I would encourage you to ask your REB. I'm sorry, I'm taking time here collecting these. I'm sorting through the questions, trying to find ones that aren't repeats. Is solicitation of materials, recorded personal stories and letters for a public archive to be research requiring a review? It doesn't sound like there's even research here if it's just, you know, collecting information. It does remind me of a question we had recently about if I'm interviewing a public figure about a private relationship or using their private papers, does that require REB review? And the answer would be yes, it does, because you're you know, delving into the private aspect of the public figure's life. Once something, of course, is in the public archive, then that is public information. And if you're only using that in your research, you do not require REB review for that. Here's a very interesting question. When participants reveal identifiable information regarding other people, does the researcher have the freedom to include this identifiable information in their report? Or does the researcher need to have REB approval to include this information? Well, you know, so no, you can't, you certainly need to have REB approval for this type of, research. And whether, revealing identifiable information is part of a privacy and confidentiality obligation that the researcher has. And, it would depend on, other aspects like, well, first they have an obligation to protect the identity of the participants, but they may have a situation where a participant has given consent to be identified, and in that case, if all the other participants have agreed to such a thing, then it is possible to reveal identifiable information. But there's a whole lot of consent seeking that goes on beforehand. Here's the question. All data that is anonymized, i.e. once was identifiable and now is not, is always subject to REB review. So, what I'm saying is that anonymized data is not exempt from REB review. Now, it might be in minimal risk, but no, you're not exempt from REB review when you're using only anonymized information. Now, again, it's up to the local REB in terms of maybe they, they may determine that you're excused from certain, normal aspects of REB review, but no, on the surface of it, anonymized information, if you're using that, you do require REB review. Okay, well, I'm really sorry that I didn't get to all the questions. I see it's 1 o'clock, and I'm going to now close this this webinar. Thank you so much for participating. Your questions are excellent. If you have a pressing need to get an answer to a question that I didn't get to, then please send it into the Secretariat on Research Ethics. Thank you.